Well, I think we got most everybody here now, so we had a little extra time this morning. We'll go ahead and get started. So we've arrived at chapter 7. Lots of different views of chapter 7, ranging all the way from very literal views of this as 144,000 people, specific people, exactly that number, to other views that are just totally idealized and bear no real connection to sort of first century events. I'm going to try to maybe go somewhere in between those two. I will say I've kind of gone back and forth with this. I was looking back at my notes from 4 years ago and looking back at the text and thinking about this for the last week or so, and I don't know, I've kind of altered my view a little bit of this. Not that that really matters that much, but so Wednesday, Lawrence covered chapter 6, and here's some images that's related to what we talked about in chapter 6. I would say, I'll point out this film analogy stuff before we're done this trimester, but as I keep trying to help you think about the presentation here as we would sort of ancient version, the way we would think about the epic film. And I think chapter 6 and 7 are sort of like the trailer for the film, in the sense that they give kind of a sweeping overview quickly of things that then we're going to come back and see much more detail on these events in later chapters. And like Lawrence said, that later chapters aren't as sequential. Well, this happened later, but more of a filling in of these events that we're going to see here. And so the sorts of things that we saw in chapter 6, well, the four horsemen. Many people don't know anything else about it. Revelation, but the four horsemen of the apocalypse, the white, black, red, is pale yellowish, green color. The darkening of the sun, the moon turning red. I didn't have a great picture of what I was trying to get to in the you're on her left. I'll let you guess. What was I driving at there? Yeah, so this is the altar, and the priests are burning up the sacrifice on the altar. The only images I could come up with that were sort of so weird. I'm not going to go with those. We'll just go with this. And you can imagine the souls underneath the altar here. And so Lawrence was pointing out these visions overlap in many ways with the Old Testament visions, these four horsemen in Zechariah 6. Then some of the other images come from, or at least are overlapping with Ezekiel 14, if you'll read that. But one of the things I thought Lawrence did most effectively Wednesday was to bring out the fact that these aren't just Old Testament visions, and also put in sort of these symbolic and visionary terms, but they're also related to things that are said in a much more straightforward manner in the New Testament. For instance, the darkening of the sun and the moon. Remember Wednesday? Where in the New Testament do we see references to this? In a speech that, at least the crux of the speech, is not using symbolic language. Remember?
The death of Jesus.
The death of Jesus, right. And how do we know that specifically these sorts of events were symbolically occurring at the death of Jesus? Well, what does Peter say in Acts 2?
That they did.
Yeah. What you're seeing here on Pentecost and the events that this is following from were spoken about by the prophet Joel in words that sound very end of the worldish, but in fact are speaking about the events that transpired with Jesus' death and resurrection, earth-shaking events. I think that's what images like earthquakes and sun and the moon changing colors of this. It's saying, hey, the world is being shaken. Everything about the universe is being upended here. Right? And then another thing that he pointed out with the saints under the altar. Remember Matthew 23? I put these up here. And, I won't go into all of it again. Anybody's talking about, Jerusalem, I wanted to bring you in. I wanted to gather you to me. But on you is going to come all the blood that's been shed on the earth, of these prophets that have been sent to Israel. And this will come on this generation, right? There's one more I wanted to allude. Lawrence ran out of time at the very end. But in Revelation 6, talks about the kings and the generals, they're all going to look for places to hide, and they'll call to the mountains and rocks and say, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne, from the wrath of the Lamb. Where in the New Testament do we see language that is almost verbatim used here?
Fall of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
The daughters of Jerusalem, about.
Yeah, Jesus is on the way to the cross. Simon has been compelled to help him. And, weeping and wailing around him, and he says, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, and then they'll say, to the mountain, all on us, and to the hills, cover us. So again, it's not just Old Testament visions, but even New Testament statements that seem to be incorporated into Revelation. And there are others in the New Testament letters we can look at. I'm not going to do that here. But he ends, and this is where Lawrence ended Wednesday night. He comes, he says, all of these earth-shaking and terrible, as later tribulation events are going to happen. And so then what question arises at the end of chapter 6?
Who can stand?
Who can stand? Who's going to be able to prevail given the world is being assaulted in this way? And so that brings us to chapter 7. And so John says, and after this, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth, to prevent any wind from blowing on the land or the sea or on any tree. Then I saw another angel coming up from the east, having the seal of the living God, and he called out in a loud voice to the 4 angels who had been given power to harm the land and the sea, do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we put a seal on the foreheads of the servants of our God. And so, what we see in chapter 6, it seems now the angels have been tasked with executing the events talked about in chapter 6. But, hold on, before you do this, we also need to do something. And we need to put a seal on the foreheads of the servants of God. Now, and this is partly what I've been doing the last week or two and reading back over this and thinking about it. Where are these events occurring? Where are these people that we're going to talk about? Where are the angels?
The 4 corners of the earth.
Yeah, the 4 corners of the earth. So I think one thing that separates from the first half of this chapter, the second half, is the focus on things that are happening on the earth versus things that are happening in the heavens. And so he says, all right, go out, and what are they to do now? I didn't write all this down. I didn't put a slide. Who are these people that are sealing? Where are they drawn If you have your Bible there, if you know chapter 7, the people who are going to be sealed are listed, not individually, but as groups. Well, what groups are being incorporated?
The tribes.
Tribes of Israel. So, yeah, again, I don't subscribe to them. These are exactly 144,000. It's 12 tribes, 12,000 from each. You know, it's the idea that, okay, we're saving this whole group. But these are people, I think, again, here that are Christians. I think these are people that are serving the Lamb. Maybe it references back to other faithful of Israel. That's one of the things that Lawrence mentioned this Wednesday night. I think one of the difficulties of studying Revelation is I think sometimes some of the events referred to are referring maybe to things that happened in a specific period, whether that's the late 60s or the early 90s. But in other cases, I think it's referring to things maybe that occurred over time, maybe from 30 AD to 70 AD. And in other cases, maybe it's even reflecting back on things that have happened in prior generations. And so, you know, I don't think we have to come down hard and firm on this. But sealing the faithful of Israel, whether those are from the Old Covenant, but particularly now those from New Covenant. And so, again, this emphasis, they're from Israel. And again, some would say, well, that's symbolic too. But I think, again, we see a distinction and a designation of the chapter here that we'll get back to in a minute. All right. And then, I can put this up there. I heard, it uses this phrasing we've seen before, where he first hears and then he sees. But I heard the number who were sealed, 144,000 from all the tribes of Israel. This is very similar in content to the vision Ezekiel's in Ezekiel 9. You can look over the first part, there's bring those who are going to execute judgment on the city, again, very much like the angels referred to in Revelation 7. But then he says, Lord called to the man clothed in linen who had the writing kit at his side and said to him, go throughout the city of Jerusalem and put a mark on the foreheads of those who grieve and lament over the detestable things that are done in it. And so this was written in, 590-ish BC, before this ultimate destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. They carried some off, Ezekiel was along with them, but they had not yet totally conquered or decimated the city. And so, I think most directly Ezekiel 9 is referencing this. Revelation seems to be a very similar vision and probably about sort of similar types of events. But what I want to highlight here is this phrase, put a mark on the foreheads. Literally in Ezekiel, when it would have been written in Hebrew, the word mark was the Hebrew letter tav, right? So what? Well, now, this is not stuff I just pulled out my head, because I don't know anything about Hebrew. I can't read Hebrew, but in ancient Hebrew, the kind of Hebrew that was still being used in Ezekiel's day, that letter, how do you suppose it was written? Right? Like a sideways T or X, right? And in fact, this is just from the Wikipedia page. Now remember, you got to read Hebrew backwards. It goes right to left instead of left to right. But this page here refers to the Hebrew word Brit, right, which is written with modern Hebrew script that developed after Ezekiel's time on top. On the bottom is the ancient Hebrew script, Paleo Hebrew as they call it now. And so this would be the Tau, Tom. which is remarkably similar to cross. And in fact, you probably can't see this very well, but even though sort of more modern cursive Hebrew had developed by the first century, there were appearances of the old Hebrew text as sort of these revolts against Rome. And then so the last big revolt against Rome occurred in 132 AD. And in this case, and not just the Romans didn't just destroy Jerusalem, they leveled it and they moved all the Jews out and they turned it into a Roman, totally a Romanized area. But during that revolt, the Jewish rebels, I think harkening back to an earlier heritage, coined their own coins, minted their own coins. And here is the Hebrew letter tau, written in this case in this ancient Hebrew. Now, is this just coincidence? Well, one might say that. But when Ezekiel wrote this and talked about marking them with this mark of a cross, where was crucifixion?
Future.
In the future. It's thought the Persians, Herodotus mentions it among the Persians, that the Persians later, maybe 100 years or later, developed the practice of crucifixion, and the Greeks used it in a limited way, and the Romans really adopted it. But here's a practice for the future that somehow works its way in a symbolic, textual way into the sealing of these people in Ezekiel. And look, this isn't just modern thinking. It isn't just people like me. Oh, this is kind of an interesting thing. I've mentioned here before the early Christian writer Tertullian, who sort of straddled 200 AD, is one of the most famous early Christian writers. Here's what he had to say. Ezekiel's prophecy represented the very form of the cross, which he predicted would be the sign on our foreheads in the true universal Jerusalem. And Tertullian, 200 AD, is recognizing this connection that we're talking about here. Again, I don't want us to think about this as just sort of a side kind of flippant thing, but among Jewish readers, I think they would, in the first century, would have immediately began thinking, this sign, the seal. Ezekiel talked about this. This is what's being done to these faithful of Israel. Now, one additional thing, as Lawrence and I both, as we've been going along, we're trying to both connect things in a historical way where that's possible, or makes some sense, but also generalizing it and make it relevant for Christians beyond the first century. But one of the connections to the first century is, what did Jesus instruct when he was talking about these upcoming events that are going to happen to Jerusalem? What did he instruct his disciples to do? Well, he says, when you see all of these things happening, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Don't go into your house top and get anything out of the house. Don't go back to the field to get your cloak. He says it's going to be dreadful in that day for pregnant women, and pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath. So now let's remember those 144,000, or this group of faithful Israel. What are the angels told regarding them? To wait in executing this tribulation till we have sealed them, till we have marked them. We've made them safe. Well, it just so happens that Eusebius writing in the early 300s, and then another writer in the late 300s, refers to this exodus, this flight of Christians from the city of Jerusalem to particularly the city of Pella, which is in Decapolis. If you've been watching The Chosen, you know the Decapolis features in season 3. But this group of 10 cities, and it was somewhat of the 10, I think, were sort of original. It included other cities, but these cities at the time of Jesus were thought to be included, mainly other than Decapolis on the Jordan side of the Jordan River, but here's Pella. And so Christians, at least by parts, according to these early Christian writers, did heed Jesus' warning and did flee to Pella, right? So John hears about this 144,000, but then what does he see? This is sort of the interest, well, not the, but I know they're very compelling and interesting concepts. So I think one could make an argument whether this 144,000 is just about these Christians getting out of this terrible, terrible tribulation. You know, I'm not making that case, but I think it could certainly refer to them. But now, so John has heard about this, but now what does he see?
A great multitude.
Right. A great multitude from where? Everywhere. Right. After this, I looked, and there was before me a great multitude that one could not count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. And they were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands. Now, again, if you were trying to figure out, well, where are these people? What clues do we have as to their location?
They're waiting.
They're waiting, but waiting where?
Well, they're waiting for the judgment.
Yeah.
Before the throne.
Before the throne, standing in, right, standing in front of the Lamb. Now, in terms of what we've already seen, where is this? Well, in chapter 4, this was presented as this grand heavenly scene. So these seem to be people, rather than people on the earth that we were seeing, now this seems to be a heavenly vision. Now, I've skipped a few verses here to keep this thought going. So, who are they? What is happening? Well, that question emerges. Then one of the elders asked John, these in white robes, who are they? And where did they come from? And I said, well, I don't know. And he said, he answered, or excuse me, he said, John didn't say, I don't know. The elder said, sir, you do know. And he said, these are those who have come out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. So they come out of the tribulation, now standing before the throne of God. The robes are white. Now that could be a reference to cleanse from sin, but it could also be a reference to cleanse from the stains of blood, cleanse from the stains of their own martyrdom. And so maybe, and then this is where, for me, it gets a little ambiguous. Well, maybe more than a little, but are these martyrs? Are these referring to, in a more idealized way, people, whether martyred or not, who are idealized standing before the throne, but actually are still living or will live in the future? Again, my guess is that most directly this is a vision of those who have been martyred but not just martyred in this destruction and, in the lead up to the destruction of Jerusalem and this various Jewish persecutions. But again, who's this book written to? I know that's it. Who were the 7 churches of Asia? And so again, this question sometimes I think is a legit question. Well, why would these people have cared so much about what was happening over here with Jerusalem? One, Jerusalem was a big deal, I think, even for Christians in other places. But what's going on there isn't just the only thing going on in the world between 30 and 70 AD or in the 60s AD. What we already talked about has been happening in the 60s elsewhere to Christians. Persecution in Rome, again, Nero using them as a scapegoat for the fire in Rome, putting them on posts, setting them fire, feeding them to wild beasts in the Circus Maximus.
I look at this section of Scripture and I see that it's written to a people who are going into a great tribulation, and this is a snapshot of what it looks like coming out of the great tribulation. Yeah. And there is suffering going on. The Christians are suffering, but at the hands of the world. And there's a distinction, important distinction made with 144,000. And I see us separating into 2 groups. You've got God's people being separated, and then the rest I call the earth dwellers, because you'll see God's plague being poured out on the earth, and it's important to know these people are excluded from that. They're sealed, they're separated. So God's judgments on that group called the earth dwellers, his bowls of wrath, all these judgments are poured out on the earth, not God's people. It's important.
Yeah, and I think that 144,000 is definitely that. And last time around, and many think, well, this is the same group, just referred to differently and idealized, as you've said. I think around this time, I think the 144,000 are those probably sealed from this tribulation. This group is another that are coming through these times, but may not have been exempted from the troubles that have occurred. Because, among the churches that he's written to, remember back in chapter 2 and 3, what does he say some of these people are going to face? Tribulation. In fact, Smyrna in particular, he says, hey, you're gonna go through it. Some of you may even die. And so, not all Christians are going to be exempted from the collateral damage, if you will. And you think about this in Old Testament visions at the time of Ezekiel, many faithful, I think, were protected. People like Daniel were taken captive, but then it was actually captivity that put them in a better place. But other people, some of them famous, weren't exempted from trials, such as, who might be the most famous, that lived through the troubles of Jerusalem and suffered along with the people. Jeremiah.
It seems like the primary source of tribulation against the Christians are not God's judgments, but the people that give the questions of the souls under the altar. How long, O Lord, until you avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? Again, the earth dwellers, and talking to their brethren, how long until you avenge our blood? So that was clearly one that we can point to and say this was not God doing it, but the enemies of God's people doing it to God's people. So that one we can nail and say yes for sure.
Yeah.
But there is some ambiguity on is it collateral? Is it just the persecution? It's not really easy to determine that.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. Which brings me, I think, to now the question for subsequent generations. Okay, we're not living through the destruction of Jerusalem. We're not living through the persecution of Rome. So what's the message here for Christians down the road? Does God look after and over us? Is a message of Scripture that God protects his people? We read things like Psalms, I'm not seeing the righteous forsaken. Well, is that an absolute in the sense that, therefore, I've never seen righteous people suffer? Well, even if David is that psalmist, even David, one could not say that about David. And so there is this paradox that whether in collateral suffering for God's judgments on the evil and the unfaithful, people like Jeremiah suffer. But other people like Daniel are, they go through hardships, but really are held safe from much of the suffering and trial. And I think this is a challenge for all Christians throughout all times, because if you're thinking, well, let's say you are in the first century and you're being persecuted at Smyrna, and you hear about these Christians that have escaped this terrible tribulation, what would be your feelings about that? Would you be, oh, that is so great. God is watching over his people. Maybe. But what might also be a response?
Why me?
Right. Why is God not watching over me? Again, some of us, I think, are more inclined to verbalize that or think it in our heads. Others of us might sort of think it, but not let yourself dwell on it. But the psalmist, David and the others, did they think about that question? Yes, they do. Did Job think about that question? Yes, he did. And I think so what then would be the overarching message of say, Revelation 7, regardless of which group you may be in?
They end up in the
Yeah, right. All of them are under God's care and protection. Their path to standing in front of the Lamb, their path to being given these robes of white, different. But I think this is critical of seeing our troubles, not just as something to endure, but as something that connects us with the people of God and connects us with Jesus himself. That I may talk about this down the road later, but not only did Jesus bear a cross, but what does he say to us with regard to crosses?
Take up ours and follow him.
Right? Take up our own cross and follow him. And yet he also says, follow me because my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Well, which is it? The cross and seemingly a heavy burden, or a light yoke? Well, it may be one or the other. I think partly Jesus is talking about my yoke there versus the yoke being placed on you by these religious leaders who are weighing you down with all sorts of stuff. He goes, my yoke is easy in comparison to that. But if you're not willing to take up whatever your burden is, that at first, he's just talking about light things here. If you're not willing to take that up, what does he say? You're not worthy of me. And this comes back, chapters 2 and 3 really are a challenge to Christians both in the first century and today. Christ has called us to him. He's called us to say, whatever happens, my faith in you is going to remain firm. But that doesn't mean we don't express things like this psalmist, or where are you? Doesn't mean we don't express things that both David and Jesus expressed. Why have you abandoned me? Look, we're going to have those feelings. Sometimes I think we feel guilty if we have a feeling. Lord, why are you helping them and not me? But if we have those feelings, to whom should we express them? Just in our own head? to our neighbor, to our friend, to our spouse? No, to him. I mean, we can certainly express that to our spouse or others. But most fundamentally, Psalms is telling us, hey, the Holy Spirit is somehow guiding people like David and others to say it is okay to express to God, why have you abandoned me? Why aren't you helping me? That's, in many ways, that's not a statement of disbelief. It's a statement of belief. It's a statement, I believe you have power. I believe you can help. I believe you can seal people. Why have you abandoned me?
I've often thought that's why Dan was left out of this list.
Who?
Dan. The tribe. of
Oh,
Dan.
yes.
They could look and say, why us?
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't mention that, but the list, starts with Judah, which makes sense in the fact that Judah now has been elevated through Christ. But yeah, Dan is excluded. So you're thinking, why? Well, so you've got to have 12 12s, and you're going to include both of Joseph's sons. Well, so we're going to have to.
And they're saying, why?
Yeah. What about us? No, and it may partly deal with the fact that Dan, maybe like Simeon, seemed to kind of evaporate almost as a tribe. But yeah, no. But these people then who are standing before the throne, what are they doing? Right, serving day and night, saying things like they're before the throne and serving day and night in his temple, and he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. Never again will they hunger, never again will they thirst. The sun will not be down on them, nor any scorching heat. The Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd. He will lead them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Which is, again, very heavenly sounding, very, it'll all be good then. But I want to bring that back to something we've mentioned before. Well, again, there's some ambiguity there because things said in the New Testament, like Peter, I've referred to this before in here, this inheritance is kept in heaven for you. You're shielded by God's power. But then he says, in all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. And again, Peter's probably writing somewhere near this Nero persecution. So they're shielded, but he said they should be greatly rejoicing because even though they have these trials, he said, you believe in Christ, you believe in him and are filled with an inexpressible and a glorious joy, for you are receiving the end of your faith, the salvation of your souls. Well, is that salvation something we only receive at the end? No, but I think one of the big messages to these Christians of the first century is, yes, there is this glorious setting, standing before the throne with a great multitude from every tribe, nation, and tongue. But there is also something you have now. And I think all of us are given at times to discounting what we have now. We have the salvation of our souls now. And who has that? Well, that's the interesting thing too. This great multitude, as we've said, drawn from every tribe, nation, and tongue. How many Christians were there in 60 or 90 AD? That's a special quiz question. Well, we don't know. I mean, maybe 50,000. There are guesses like that. By the second century, maybe in the hundreds of thousands, somewhere late second century. And then by the time Eusebius is writing and Rome begins to tolerate Christianity, in the millions. From where? On Pentecost, where are they from? Jews, they're Jews, only proselyte Jews, but they're from all over. And this message is spread all over the Roman Empire, and people like Eusebius and others are to be believed. People like Thomas has carried it as far as the Indus or Ganges valleys in India. Maybe others as far as Britain. I mean, part of the message, yes, Christ wins in the end. But one big message of this trailer is Christ is winning now. He was winning in 30 AD. He was winning in 60 AD, in 90 AD, in 200, and he's winning in 2023. And that's sometimes hard for us to see. And I think that's a big part of why Revelation is written. It's not only, like I said, not only does Christ win, he is winning. And I think it's easy to think that it's not. I get discouraged. You see events and trends. But the long-standing trend of the last 2,000 years is not Christ is losing. It's that Christ is winning. We have people like hiding with this. Well, she's evidence that Christ is winning. If you get down, you think, I don't know. Think of Heidi and the people she knows from parts of the world that most of us haven't been to. That we're going to come back to that theme later, but that's the trailer, right? So you have sort of Christ wins. You got a little bit more vision here, and then we'll start digging into more and more stuff. Scott's going to be teaching Wednesday night over more side of town, so you all keep that straight. I want to thank Ed Hands for doing that. Thank you all this morning. Anything else you'd like to add? We have a minute or two.
I thought it was interesting that the elder asked John who these people were, as if John should have had an inkling or an idea.
Yeah, you do know.
Seeing the future or
Yeah.
who these multitudes, innumerable multitude was.
Isaac.
Another interpretation, another possible interpretation of specifically verse 14, who these people are, it talks about they have washed their robes. It's in the blood of the Lamb, but they did it themselves. And so I almost wonder if this is a reference to people who the tribulations they've been through have drawn them to Christ, which kind of makes me think of the parable of the prodigal son. I could have this temptation to discount people who decide to follow Jesus based on the punishments that they've incurred for the things that they've done. I think a part of verse 14 on and how it talks about that, God is sheltering them now. They've washed themselves. They've potentially, it sounds like they've repented, and God has accepted them, even though He didn't handpick them originally.
Right. Thank you. Thank you all. You all have a good, great week.